I'm just going back to your original question about 5-MeO and meditation. And I think Sam Harris has talked quite a bit on his meditation app about the limited utility of psychedelics contrasted with meditation, that psychedelics can be useful in introducing people to non-dual realms. But to his mind, there's something to be wary of about psychedelics because they're ultimately distorting and they can't really be brought under any kind of agency. And I think he betrays in that a very, very singular idea of what a psychedelic experience is, that it can only be done in heroic doses, that it can only be done individually. He doesn't even mention the role of a therapist, let alone more communal aspects of taking psychedelics. And so he uses psychedelics rather as a straw man. For me, though, I think that very much depending on dosage and depending on context, then rather than being strapped to a rocket, as Sam Harris suggests, or stuck on a freight train from which there is no escape, I think taking a smaller dose in a context that's either solitary or with people, but going out to meet the psychedelic experience with a sense of agency, a sense of curiosity, as well as the humility you mentioned earlier, gives rise to something that's much more has got much more potential in terms of promoting virtues or awakening in a longer term and more meaningful way.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think there's these two aspects. You can talk about the awakening or the kind of the blast off to these kind of experiential insights that can kind of puncture suffering for a period of time. And then there's the integration, the far more grounded kind of embodied feeling side of things, where you don't have to be doing heroic doses. You can even be doing a microdose, but you're really going into your emotions and feeling it in an embodied way. And I agree, like that stuff seems to be, from what I've seen of Sam Harris's stuff, seems to be kind of missed out. There seems to be a focus on the experiential, but not on the intimate, embodied, right, emotional kind of integrating thing.
Right.
Hi everyone, welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. Good to be back with you after the summer break. My guest this week is Andy Mitchell. Andy is a neuropsychologist who specialized in the treatment of patients with rare brain conditions, head injuries, and epilepsy, as well as the application of mindfulness for patients with neurological conditions. And he's the author of the new book, 10 Trips, The New Reality of Psychedelics, which is what we talk about today. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Andy Mitchell. Andy, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much, James. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so you've just written this book, 10 Trips, I have here. And you're a neuropsychologist, right? So I wonder if you could share a bit about your background and how you came to be interested in psychedelics.
Yeah, I mean, I've had different incarnations, but for the last 20 years, I've worked in clinical neuroscience, mainly in large hospitals, doing a range of different things, from working in neurosurgery, neurointensive care, and diagnosis. I took a sabbatical of 3 or 4 years ago and looked at, with the express intent of looking at the possibility of using meditation and yoga in clinical neurology as a rehab tool. And during that, I encountered a lady who was offering psychedelic ceremonies. I hadn't taken any drugs or drink for about 20 years. I had all sorts of defenses against the idea of psychedelics, but she was very cogent. And over the course of a few weeks, she sort of persuaded me sensibly to at least give it a go. And I did. And it was quite the experience. So I'd written a couple of books for Penguin under a pseudonym, and the publishers really wanted to do something to update and broaden the Michael Pollan inspired explosion of psychedelic hype. And they thought, given my background, not just in clinical neuroscience, I've got other sort of professional and literary engagements. They thought I might be quite a good person, well suited to to open up some of the critical positions on psychedelic science and psychedelic psychotherapy. And so they asked me to write something, and they sort of set me a challenge. And that's where the title 10 Trips came. They said, let's make it as broad as possible. Do 10 different substances in 10 very different contexts, from a neuroimaging lab all the way through to the Amazon with everything in between, and use that as a platform then to really, cast a different kind of perspective on the psychedelic renaissance. So that was it, really.
Right. And you began, as you say, with a kind of, would you say with skepticism?
I mean, what do you mean by skepticism?
I mean, you were describing when you were talking to the person who gave you the first, who convinced you to undertake the first trip, right? That there was a kind of hesitancy regarded against it.
That was more terror. I mean, with philosophically, there was definitely skepticism, and I can talk a little bit about that. But in terms of my resistance to her, I had 20 years of conditioning about addiction and substance misuse, and all of that had to be intricately sort of dismantled or suspended, at least, for me to engage in this sort of first-person experiment. So, but as for the sort of philosophical skepticism, yeah, I mean, from a distance, I'd always taken an interest in. I'd taken somewhat of an interest in the sort of neuroscience of psychedelics as it was being reported. But, I know firsthand how difficult it is to treat mental health. I know how sort of impoverished and beleaguered psychiatry is. I know that that there's nothing really come along pharmacologically for the last 40 years of any renown. So when there's a new remedy and people are talking about net zero trauma and such like claims, it just feels very, very much a long way away from being on the ground in clinical services. So yes, skeptical from that point of view.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you dissected the concept of skepticism there, because because I was presenting it as a broad kind of just resistance to these substances, but you nicely kind of pointed out that there can be this personal, emotional sense of like, I don't want to go into that, radically kind of open space, that mind manifesting space. And unless one has the awareness to spot that in oneself, and the kind of the honesty with oneself about what motivates them, some people I think can slip into a kind of protective, a stance of intellectual skepticism, but it's actually coming from an emotional terror, and they're kind of conflating the two. So it's nice that you picked those apart there.
And it's well, thank you. And I would say now on the other end of the experiences, in fact, there was something like rather than 10 trips, I ended up doing something like 40 different trips in a very compressed amount of time, and that finished about a year ago. And I would say that things have very much sort of settled down into a sort of stable memory of those experiences. And I would say the skepticism has deepened and enriched. It's certainly not made me an acolyte and apologist for psychedelics, although I'm also totally bewitched by them. So all I would say is that my skepticism has just become much more nuanced and complicated than it was prior to diving in.
Right. Yeah. So I think there's a lot to talk about here, because as you say, whilst not being an evangelist, you're not saying we should stop the research, and you're not like suggesting so there's a nuanced middle ground to be explored. And so you mentioned this idea that Rick Doblin of MAPS has been saying recently of net zero trauma. Was it by 2050 or some very close target?
The dates change. He moves the dates around.
But yeah, I agree that to speak like that is to fundamentally misunderstand the human condition and the kind of possibility for transcending the suffering that comes with everyday life. And so there is stuff out there that's very hyped up and kind of ungrounded. But there's also genuine, instances of healing and of people moving through, of symptoms resolving, some of the MDMA trials of particular acute traumas being healed. But I think it's interesting, right, the way that it's presented. Often one of the kind of narratives that got the psychedelic renaissance off the ground is this like one-shot solution, right? You've got PTSD, we do maybe 3 sessions of MDMA, maybe even 1, and now you don't have PTSD anymore. And even though that can be technically true by not meeting the criteria, again, I think it takes us back into this richer view of the human condition of thinking, well, actually, sure, maybe you've addressed one trauma, but someone's whole life story, all of their issues that play out through them, is a very complex thing and would require years and years of exploration. And the idea that you're just going to kind of solve it all isn't necessarily the right framing. But I also understand why there's this kind of excitement to kind of get it off the ground. I'll let you come back in on that.
Yeah. Well, I think that, the idea that there would be sort of, if you were to invent a sort of perfect magic bullet for modern malaise, it would be instantaneous, radical. It would have an ecological bent to it. It would have an atavistic indigenous history that allowed people to feel good about its provenance and such like. If it's all I'm saying is sort of cynically is that, if psychedelics hadn't existed and been neglected and obscured, something like that might have been invented. It would perfectly fits our need for a certain type of profile of antidote to the human condition at the moment, and there's something about the way that the culture has idealized it and wrapped around it and capitalized it and financed it that shows everything about the culture and very little about psychedelics. And then meanwhile, you get a certain type of science that's, I think Robin Carhart Harris compared psychedelic science to the hero's journey. And I can see what he means, because there's something, we're in a very callow, adolescent, overly idealized stage of that journey when it comes to psychedelic science, and the claims being made and the kind of research that's being done is suggestive of that callowness. And that's not a reason not to do it, but it's also a tip to the cap of the tendency for certain idioms of science towards a sort of cultishness and a fashionableness and a self-reinforcing, self-validating, self-congratulatory, bravura about their claims.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So part of the reason I'm interested in psychedelics is because I do have, I guess, a sense that the modern mental health epidemic, or whatever you want to call it, the level of human suffering we see in the modern world is the product of some kind of alienation, some issue that's happened where many cultures have had, wisdom traditions around interdependence, connection, and balance, and all of that. And we've gone into this hyper control. We're in some pathologized. I think you can probably pathologize it, but some state that needs diagnosing and then relaxing back into the wisdom of those kinds of perspectives. And psychedelics seem to be a way to kind of open people up to that kind of way of being. But even if one takes that worldview, you're absolutely right that it's not a slam dunk in the sense that suddenly they're put on the market, then everyone wakes up and goes, "Oh, great, let's move back to this wonderful idyllic, image of how life could be." But instead, as you say, like capital comes in and distorts it, it appropriates things, it just gets kind of, and all the dynamics in science, like it just becomes kind of co-opted and distorted and used by the current culture in ways that are not aligned with this vision that I'm pointing towards, in a way where I don't know which of those forces wins, or if there is a winning, or if that's just the situation we're in is a kind of perpetual dance between that controlling, distorting urge and the opening. I see the psychedelics as a kind of opening to connection, to interdependence. So yeah, there's a lot of dynamics going on there. And is there, to go from the complexity to something more simple, is there a kind of a use? Your background in mental health, but you're also critical of the idea that psychedelics just map onto this is like a simple mental health antidote. Is there an area where you think these are going to be particularly useful? Like, how would you like to see psychedelics used?
Well, I'm certainly not sold on the again, it's hard to keep it simple. It's hard to say. I mean, I could say that it appears that those conditions, if you're dealing with mental health and pathology, those conditions that have as their kind of basis some ruminatory, obsessional mode of thinking, and then the behaviors that that accord with that. Those sorts of things seem to lend themselves to having things disordered and broken up and fragmented and respun by psychedelics. That intuitively that makes sense. But although I said I was skeptical, I also think that there are many different models for psychedelic usage, and the medical being only one of them. And I can equally get on board with religious or spiritual, new age or shamanic, or recreational and psychonautical uses of psychedelics. So they all have different appeals. I think the key problem for me, or the key ingredient to my skepticism, is that each vantage point wants to make some kind of model out of these substances. And the thing about these substances, which is probably inherent in anything, any object, any cultural artifact, it's just that with psychedelics, the volume of that's turned up, is that they just take on the shape of the people that are modeling them and reflect back both the proclivities and the blind spots of those modeling them. And I remember at the start of the book, I thought that this was a virtue, that it was great to have all of these perspectives, and that you've got a kind of, what you've got in the middle of that is this multifaceted jewel, and each perspective, even though it might lead to tribalism, offers something new about the jewel itself. But sort of by the end of going around the world and engaging with these things, I thought that metaphor just doesn't hold ground. And instead, rather than a multifaceted jewel, psychedelics are more like water, in that we know everything about water at a scientific level, but its biology, its chemistry, something of its physics, and yet we don't know what the shape of water is, or rather we only know what the shape of water is if we have a container for it. And then all we know is the shape of that container rather than the shape of water. And these different models, be it medical or religious or shamanic, for example, they all bear the marks of their own containment rather than actually getting down to the thing itself, which always seems to slip the net in some way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think this almost reflective property where the psychedelics reflect the expectations of the user, and they amplify the whatever you're expecting to get from them. There's a mode of approaching them, I think, that is different to other modes, which is to use them in the spirit of kind of what you did early on in the conversation, in terms of like self accountability of we were talking about skepticism and being honest with oneself. Am I genuinely intellectually skeptical about this thing, or am I having an emotional reaction? So effectively, we're talking about kind of mindfulness or meditation, like that whole field, that whole area of bringing awareness to one's own dynamics and really trying to hold oneself accountable and not be lost and deluded. And when they're used in that way, I guess this is the kind of intersection with kind of awakening, like waking up out of delusion, and kind of Buddhist traditions. I think there's really fertile ground there where it's kind of would lead to the opposite of tribalism. The kinds of people who would use them in that way would be increasingly humble about their own perspective and come more and more to that vantage point that you described, where reality is like a multifaceted jewel that can be seen from many aspects, and there is no single overarching way of kind of grasping it. And you have a chapter in the book, right, on meditation and psychedelics, where you tried 5-MeO-DMT, which is the kind of, there's a lot of interest there in whether the 5-MeO states mirror certain kind of meditative states. Maybe you can share a bit about that experience.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just catching up with what you're saying about, I really like the idea that there's something about sort of humble self-inquiry as a sort of disposition to take into psychedelics, which leads to a kind of fruitfulness. And I certainly buy into that. My experience with that particular experience that I reported on with 5-MeO was in a New Age retreat center in Mexico, and I was really discombobulated by the shaman, who, by his own account, had taken 5-MeO every single night for 10 years, and it had become his own practice. And he justified this on the grounds that it gave him a kind of messianic, visionary capacity to read people's minds and heal the afflicted. Meanwhile, I've, as well as having, my radar, a bullshit radar, working overtime, I'm terrified that I'm now putting myself at the mercy of this guy. Now, if I just segue to meditation, I spent 3 years as a monk practicing meditation in my 20s. I had a long grounding in Buddhist Vipassana, and had recently become more interested in both Dzogchen and Koan meditation. And at the time of going into this 5-MeO session, I was working on koans with an instructor, and that was very much my intention, was that I was working on the koan. What is this? Which just with a koan, you take in a phrase. Just for anyone who doesn't know, you take in a phrase into meditation. You use your cognition to just basically eat itself, because the koan defeats it. It provides a kind of conceptual cul-de-sac for your thinking, and something happens in that defeat. So I've got this koan on the go, and the shaman passes me the 5-MeO, and there's something about him in that particular moment. He's taken his own hit of 5-MeO. His eyes have started rolling back. It just stops me from going for full breakthrough. I've had full breakthrough experiences on 5-MeO, but I take this kind of intermediate state where literally the world, I think McKenna calls it a sort of chrysanthemum state, and the sort of space-time tessellates in a very interesting way, but I still have my own coordinates. I've not completely lost, I haven't completely disappeared. And just out of the corner of my eye, as I'm trying to focus on my koan, my shaman has what I recognize as a tonic-clonic seizure. I used to work in epilepsy. He's clearly showing the signs of having this seizure. And I am just physically unable to go and look after him in that moment. But I'm certainly not able to adequately meditate. And interestingly enough, his wife cared for him and brought him around. But such is the sort of such was the importance of him carrying off his act as a visionary and a messianic character. He tried to pass off this epileptic seizure as for my benefit, that he was bringing down demonic, or drawing out demonic forces from me, and bringing down some sort of healing spirits. So I've not really given a good example of how meditation works in 5-MeO DMT, but I've given you some idea of the kind of shenanigans that can take place alongside the DMT experience.
Yeah, I mean, 5-MeO definitely again and again births these kinds of messianic figures, and there's a bit of a it's the kind of thing where I think there's usually some skill involved where they actually, with their confidence, do help people, like help kind of, with 5-MeO, it feels almost like to me like a kind of like an existential birthing. And so it's like they're playing this kind of existential midwives, like guiding people through this huge release. And there can be some skill in that. And once you've done that a few times, I think, and people look at you with a sense of gratitude for helping them through this massive release, I think it can go to people's heads very, very quickly. And then, so there's this weird thing where they're not full on charlatans, but there's like a messianic delusional kind of thing that can happen quite easily with 5-MeO, especially since it blows past all of your defenses. And so then all of your defenses sneak in hidden ways and make you act really neurotically, so it's a very, yeah, it's one to to beware, I think. But I'm interested in you said you had some full breakthrough experiences that you didn't write about in the book. Can you share? I guess I'm interested in, with the what is this koan, right? Like the state, the non-dual state of just of isness, that of just kind of being, that is being used to elicit or to connect with, is, I think effectively the same thing that happens with the 5-MeO trip, where you're forced into that, you're neurophysiologically kind of forced into that recognition, that state. Did you have any sense of something like that in with the
Yeah,
breakthrough experiences?
I mean, there's research to suggest now of long-term meditators taking, I think, high dose psilocybin, finding in the breakdown of identity states that are familiar to them from meditation. I've certainly never been cannonballed in meditation to where I've been to with 5-MeO, but in what I found from breakthrough experiences with 5-MeO is that the 10 or 15 minutes of total whiteout and loss of all coordinates of selfhood are less interesting and less meaningful than the sort of 45 minutes after that, where one can, rather like the layers of an onion skin, see every single sort of geological strata of the construction of who you are through history, both going back to the moment of your birth and to the moment that you find yourself reborn 50 years later. And that kind of experience in very condensed form is very similar to aspects of what happens in meditation, especially when one's on a sort of longer intensive retreat, and the physiology starts to change, and the degree of focus and mindfulness becomes kind of inescapable and saturating, and then strange things, strange psychophysical things start to happen in that state. It was very, very familiar to that. And I'm just going back to your original question about 5-MeO and meditation, and I think Sam Harris has talked quite a bit on his meditation app about the limited utility of psychedelics when contrasted with meditation. That psychedelics can be useful in introducing people to non-dual realms, let's just say non-dual realms. But to his mind, there's something sort of minatory and in something to be wary of about psychedelics, because they're ultimately distorting and they can't really be brought under any kind of agency. And I think he betrays in that a very, very sort of singular idea of what a psychedelic experience is, that it can only be done in heroic doses, that it can only be done individually. He doesn't even mention the role of a therapist, let alone more communal aspects of taking psychedelics. And so there's a sort of straw. He uses psychedelics rather as a straw man, and it, for me though, I think that very much depending on dosage and depending on context, then meeting, rather than being strapped to a rocket, as Sam Harris suggests, or stuck on a freight train from which there is no escape, I think taking a smaller dose in a context that's either solitary or with people, but going out to meet the psychedelic experience with a sense of agency, a sense of curiosity, as well as the humility you mentioned earlier, gives rise to something that's much more sort of, has got much more potential in terms of I guess promoting virtues or awakening in a longer term and more meaningful way.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think there's these two aspects. I mean, obviously many more than that with psychedelics and meditation, but you can talk about the awakening or the kind of the blast off to these kind of experiential insights that can kind of puncture suffering for a period of time. And then there's the integration, the far more grounded kind of embodied feeling side of things where you don't have to be doing heroic doses. You can even be doing a microdose or something, but you're really going into your emotions and feeling it in an embodied way. And I agree, like that stuff seems to be, from what I've seen of Sam Harris's stuff, seems to be kind of missed out. There seems to be a focus on the experiential, but not on the intimate, embodied, emotional kind of integrating thing.
Right. So as an interesting adjunct, then this whole idea of microdosing, at least in the sort of clinical scientific literature, is based on doses that are subperceptual. But I think meditators have reported taking sort of definitionally microdosed amounts of psychedelics, and in fact finding rather than being subperceptual, they're incredibly evocative and rich perceptually if you bring a certain quality of attention and stillness to it. So it seems like the whole sort of taxonomy of psychedelics versus meditation, microdosing versus macrodosing, perceptual versus subperceptual, is just very sort of clunky and coarse at this distance.
And that reminds me of, there was a chapter in your book with where you were going to be functioning as a therapist, right? For was he a priest?
He's a monk,
a monk who took a very large dose of mushrooms, right? But it didn't seem to have much of an effect,
right? And well, that's another sort of I mean, who knows why it didn't have an effect on him? But one quite obvious candidate is that he had treatment-resistant depression for 30 years. Now they're doing studies at the moment, even one last week, reporting success with people with treatment-resistant depression and large doses of psilocybin. But the criteria for treatment-resistant depression are so shallow compared to the experience of people I've worked with. There's in this particular guy's case, we're talking about 30 years of polytherapy on different kinds of SSRIs, SNIs, antipsychotics, sedatives. That's, which is not atypical for an American male in their 60s to have that kind of drug history. So I think it's unsurprising that might affect someone's tolerance and sensitivity. At the moment, what they're calling treatment-resistant depression is very, very, very low bar.
Right. And you also tried the same batch of mushrooms, right? So it wasn't that the mushrooms were just low in psilocybin.
Yeah, I mean, there was a because obviously I've not had a legal training as a in psychedelic assisted therapy. I was doing it because this guy asked me to. He was depressed and somewhat desperate. He knew I had an interest in psychedelics, so I set up on the grounds of John Hopkins using the same kind of format that John Hopkins uses. I set up a psychedelic assisted therapy session for him it was in an Airbnb quite close to Yosemite. And after 3 hours, there was just nothing. He had 7 to 8 grams of mushrooms. So I then at that point wondered if it was the mushrooms themselves. And I took, I think, 1.5 grams approximately with another guy, another monk, in fact. And then the two of us, before coming up, drove to Yosemite and just basically, just got bowled over by this combination of a small amount of mushrooms and the grand majesty of Yosemite National Park.
Yeah, it makes me think of what you were saying about the meditators as well. There's definitely, I mean, we're just coming on set and setting here, I guess, as well. It's going to be very different with different people. At the start of the conversation, actually, I wanted just, if you wouldn't mind, just for the audience, I was going to ask you to kind of list the 10 trips and just give a brief kind of overview. But I guess you've said that there were over 40, right? So, but I wonder if you could just share a bit about what you think are the highlights and, just share what was the any notable ones, any less interesting ones.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I spent some time, I don't know if you're familiar with the Cooke tribe in the Sierra Nevada of Colombia, but they're the kind of...
From your book.
Well, amongst the sort of monastic communities that I've knocked around with for the last 30 years, they're the kind of black belts. I mean, the Cooke live in the Sierra Nevada. It's a tribe that have been in existence for 1,500 years, and they've largely been untouched by colonialism because of the height at which they live. And they have a priest class called mamas who are brought up in caves for the first 18 years of their lives. learning and being taught the sort of Cooke cosmology via what you might think of as a really acute interoceptive sense of how the body maps onto the universe. And they become adept at the sort of the way that the shifts in the body are reflected in the natural world. And so I was invited to do a divination service with them, and they don't use a psychedelic, but they use coca leaves, which heightens their ability to read their body and the natural world. And I think what that experience of divination brought home to me is that there's whatever we mean by psychedelic or mind manifesting substances is something that's so deeply inscribed unnarcotically into certain ways of being. And the way that the Kogi are just always folding set and setting into every single moment and reading the things that are happening outside of them in the terms of what's happening inside of them, and the sort of circularity of the time, and how all of their behaviors and practices seem to be enfolded by this rich sense of the world manifesting moment by moment. I think that even in terms of sort of philosophically and emotionally, that was definitely the high point. I think of substances, I think I just seem to suit the mescaline-based substances. The San Pedro cactus for me was taking a strong wachuma in the mountains with the Kero tribe and walking and having silence, walking for hours, having periods of silent meditation and music, it just kept on breaking my heart open in a way that was just inexplicably pleasurable. And again, the pleasure was with seeing not phantasmagorias of that had never been seen before, but just seeing what was always there, and the tears coming from the fact that it was always there and I tend to neglect it, or I'm insufficiently attentive to it.
Right. Yeah, my experience with San Pedro was similarly walking in nature, and it felt very much like being in a Van Gogh painting or something, simultaneously in the Garden of Eden, just kind of everything just kind of glowing, and feeling my bodily sensations in this kind of pleasurably animalistic way, just being aware of my kind of being a feeling living thing. And yeah, nothing mind-blowing, but except one moment when I took off my kind of cable knit jumper that had kind of quite a loose stitch, and as I lifted it up, seeing the sun through it was like being in a mosque with like a kind of jeweled ceiling, and I like gasped, right. And I thought that was a kind of classically kind of psychedelic moment of someone just taking off their jumper and giggling underneath because they're so in awe of the light patterns.
I remember ending up at this garden, and a real garden. It was a cactus garden on this mountainside. It was a volcano. At the side of a volcano, someone had built a mescaline farm there, and it was Easter Sunday, and I'm sort of planted myself, and it's dusk next to these cactuses, and there's a yew tree about 20 yards ahead of me, and it was kind of, I hadn't been paying any attention to it. Anyway, I looked up, remembering that it was Easter Sunday. I looked up and saw a human figure crucified on the yew tree. Except for the fact the man was made of wood and the tree was alive, and it instantly made me think that for 2,000 years we've just got it the wrong way around. We should turn the crucifixes round, and it was the tree that was suffering at the man's expense.
That's great. Well, you end the book on this note of kind of the importance of nature connection for our. It sounds like you're in the book signaling that it's you say something about it being kind of crucial for the survival of our civilization, that we have this kind of nature connection. Did that inspiration come from the things you're referring to? The kind of
I mean, it's not really where I end the book, but it's definitely that was the sort of central message of the Kogi civilization, and it's not. Again, it's like a lot of the psychedelic studies talk about connectedness with nature and eco consciousness, and we know from the studies that go on to then look at changes in behavior, there's very little discernible difference in people's behavior, irrespective of how green they might have felt at the time. But having the Cooke, who literally do not, who think of nature in such a different, who just don't objectify it in the way that we do, that it's always, animistically got its own personality, its own agency, and they're engaging with it as sort of equals rather than as sort of at the top of the chain of being. That was hard to escape. I mean, it's sort of counter to all of our training in the West, but it was hard to escape its validity and the sort of richness that it afforded their lives.
Yeah, I mean, the studies you're referencing, the nature connectedness ones, I do remember one of them showed there were first off, that the eco-consciousness effects kind of lasted a very long time. I think it might have been 2 years, maybe it was 6 months, but it also did correlate with an increase in pro-environmental behavior. But that's one study, and it may not be.
Yeah, I don't mean to diminish it. I think what happens is that the studies exist, and then there's stuff that's branded on the basis of the studies, and I think some of the branding of what psychedelics can do for you just do more damage than good in terms of overstating their effect.
So I think I think it comes across that you definitely have this concern, which is a good concern to have, about what the kind of the branding and the venture capital money and like all of that side of how kind of trying to sell these as a product is going to, or is corrupting or misstating what they're capable of. But there's this, I guess you're also an advocate for basically saying that indigenous groups and the underground have a valid perspective. We shouldn't just be looking at just the medical model and just the kind of the startups that are trying to, pharma companies that are trying to kind of patent this stuff. And so I totally agree with that. I think a lot of the excitement rather than hype, I would say, comes from the people who are, I guess, at a more grassroots level, right? Who see potential here for psychedelics to change culture in a positive way. I mean, they obviously had that huge effect in the 60s, a huge effect on culture, and a feeling that maybe that could happen again in a way that it gets channeled into positive change. Do you see, I guess we've spoken about the kind of skepticism about the claims in the medical model. Does that extend to these other areas, I guess?
I mean, that's an interesting question to me, because I think I've got an extra dose of skepticism from the medical model because of my own personal history and my own limitations and my own childhood shaping towards what doctors were and such like, and that, I think there's, as well as there being a kind of conceptual distrust, there's also an autobiographical loading and bias of that. I think to get into any of these models, religious, shamanic, psychonautical, with any degree of intimacy with them, I think some skepticism is like just important, because people just aren't very good at building models, and they always manage to inscribe their own prejudices and wishes and ideologies into it. And with psychedelics being as suggestible, as these sort of super suggestible vehicles, I think those biases become more important. But that's not to say that I think, as you suggested, that all of them have got sort of quite radical virtues associated with them too, and in different ways. And it's hard to make those ways concordant with each other, because it may be great to be using psychedelics recreationally for pleasure. It may be great. It's hard for people in science to say that. It's hard for people in religions to say that. But equally with religions, they may not have an idea of mental health in the same way that that clinicians do. They may be looking at the flourishing of being, or the growing into your inheritance, or something like that. And meanwhile, shamanically, well, who really can understand, like from our culture at least, the sort of cosmology and utility of shamanic psychedelics? But but it's certainly, and that's the other thing to say about each of these things, is that they're not just one monolithic thing. There's many different variations of shamanic approaches to psychedelics that have their own cultural and historical coordinates. Similarly with spiritual and even to an extent scientific uses of studies of psychedelics. So,
right. And you mentioned how your own, as with anyone on this subject, they're subjective, and so your own biases and your own experiences come to shape your views. And so I'm interested in how these undergoing these trips kind of changed you. What you noticed.
Yeah. Well, I think I expected some change, and the changes that I expected were just to be kind of a loosening up of my white Protestantism, my kind of overly intellectual grip on the world. I became more and more fluid around lots of different things. I had one powerful experience on ayahuasca where I gave birth to my own children, and I found myself just being drawn to more and more expressions of femininity in the wake of that. Something that, growing up in Yorkshire in a sort of lower middle class family in the pub, it was just not, there was a long way from there. So some of that, but then there were things that happened. There was something that happened collectively across all of the trips that just made me realize very profoundly my own relationship to truth and exaggeration, and how there's something about the general tone that I have when I engage with the world that's just got a sort of defensiveness that's totally outgrown its purpose. And so I ended up kind of a bit in a heap, thinking that I'd started off on this kind of rational, sort of neuroscientific project to do first-person experiments, and in the end it had got me, and I was this kind of somewhat of a mess, realizing that this was all, in fact, it was my own sort of personal psychological odyssey, and I just needed to, look after myself in a different way rather than anything else. In terms of how these things have stayed with me, I think I've sort of deliberately steered clear of psychedelics since I finished the book, and I think that I'm so glad they exist. I feel very grateful for their existence in the world, and currently no particular desire or motivation to re-engage with them. But I would imagine that periodically, in different ways, whether it be religious, clinical, or recreational, I will feel called to go back there and take some sort of seasonal inventory of myself.
Right. Yeah, I think seasonal. I've heard multiple people say that seems like a good. If you're doing this as an intentional practice, that seems like a good amount to do it. And the journey you described sounded very universal to me, really, to discover that kind of at the core of most of our issues is a defensiveness, is a resistance to the flow of life. This kind of takes us back into the kind of Buddhist, especially kind of like Taoist Zen type stuff. And I think that's true. I think there's we all, just because of the nature of the brain, we all accumulate experiences that then bias us in a kind of guarded way to try and spot dangers in new instances, and they can just accumulate and can completely outstay their welcome. And one of the, I do think that's, effectively what we're talking about here is the same mechanism as trauma healing with psychedelics, where it gives you an opportunity to update that and to recognize, actually, right now I'm projecting something from my past into, a situation that doesn't require it, and I can update that belief. And I think that is, if I had to say what's the one thing about psychedelics, this goes against the spirit of your book, which is celebrating the complexity and the richness of this, but I do think there's part of the excitement therapeutically is that mechanism, is that kind of updating of the beliefs we hold to bring us in line with the way reality is, instead of bringing our expectations from the past to bear in a neurotic way.
Well, I would zoom out even further and say that the one, because even that seems to frame it in overly psychotherapeutic or neuroscientific terms. I would say that it shows us something about what's required to bring newness into the world, in both individually and societally. And that way, if you keep it at that kind of general statement, you're allowed a lot of complexity as well.
Right, right. That's interesting. I like that. I think that totally fits with what I'm saying, because an aspect of what we're describing here is reality seems to be fundamentally kind of open, and in that it's just new things are happening all the time. There's no nothing kind of keeping it under control, keeping it bound. So there is just this open uncertainty in the future. And so to let go of one's resistance to life is to open to uncertainty and to novelty, and to to not be digging and grasping on to be like, no, it has to be this way, but actually to be open to multiplicity.
And really, any model is the death knell for novelty. It's saying there may be novelty, but it's on our terms. So then it sort of it works against it paradoxically.
And I think this brings us back to I think I'm always like trying to have my cake and eat it with models by looking for models that are pointers. So like the Dzogchen instructions you mentioned before that try and koans as well. Those are great examples. In Zen they talk about the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon, right? So it's like, if your model is a method to eject you from models, to then embrace the richness of existence, that's where the juice is, I think. And I think what we're pointing to here is something approximation of that.
I think there's also something for all its newness and the current interest in psychedelics, there's something deeply atavistic about going to something that is plant-based or animal-based primarily, in the face of a world that's just becoming hyper technologized. There's something about it as a sort of a newness that's found in regression, rather than the unsettling, terrifying newness that might be coming down our way and is already out of control.
Right. And you, with that dichotomy of the synthetic and the organic, your ketamine trip is the first chapter of the book, right? And that was kind of underwhelming, right? As that mentioning that as a synthetic.
I don't think I got the dosages sufficiently right, but I had these priors in the terms of neuroscience of taking a lot of recreational drugs in my early 20s, and that leading me into trouble. And 25 years later, taking ketamine wasn't insufficiently different from those things to crack me open.
Right. And I wonder if, as someone who went into this as a relative novice, right, in terms of psychedelics, do you have any advice for people who are hearing all the excitement, hearing all the hype, but they're kind of unsure about how to approach their first trip? Would you have any advice?
I mean, I think there is, that sort of generic wisdom about being with someone who's been a long way down that rabbit hole in various ways, and someone that you just like as well as trust goes a long way for securing the context. I think doing it on your own for the first time is risky. I mean, I think in general there are adverse experiences out there, and you may even if it's well controlled and you have a really reliable person, that's no guarantee against that. So I think some risk needs to be factored in, and some risk is inherent to the breakthroughs that you might make while you're on it. So just building that in for the first place, but then doing what you can to mitigate that in terms of a safe environment and a trusted person. Right.
And you, at the end of the book, you mentioned there's a list of some of the trips that didn't make it into the book, and some of them are non-pharmacological, right? Like Sweat Lodge, and there's this like stroboscopic light, right? You look at with your eyes closed, and it produces. I've done this at a festival a couple of times in conferences, and it's quite impressive how vivid the visual effects are, right?
Yeah. That was something that was designed by Anil Seth and the neuroscientist Anil Seth with John Hopkins, the musician. And they've got a lot of data now on how intensifying the frequency and brightness of the strobe in conjunction with the beats per minute of the music, can really exfoliate these hallucinations. They've got quite a bit of control, especially over what they know about how the visual cortex responds to the light and the music, with the 5H2 receptors in the visual cortex with the music and the light. They can kind of manipulate they can't shape the objects in the visual hallucination, but they can affect the strength quite dramatically, which just interesting, and just shows that we've only just really begun exploring those kinds of technologies, those extracranial non-pharmacological technologies. Yeah.
Right. And
I think that's the thing, is that in general, in terms of experiential neuroscience, things have only just started. But measurement is key. And once we can measure accurately all the different things that psychedelics do to different parts of the brain, then measurement really leads to control for both good and for ill. And so, with these AI technologies, that like the helmets that people are now investing billions of dollars in just reading exactly at a neuronal level what's happening with any particular action potential, it means that you'll be able to generate psychedelic experiences quite easily, I think, within the context of artificial intelligence in 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I can imagine that leading to a quite terrifying Grey Goo situation of, once AI starts to kind of optimize for us individually, I can imagine us slipping down a wormhole of kind of addiction to that kind of
course, yeah.
self-stimulation,
yeah, totally.
I think that nature connection thing is probably the antidote, if there is one. Yeah. So maybe to end on, you mentioned early in the book that you're broadly a kind of physicalist, materialist, and I don't think you say that anything radically changed in that area, but I wonder if we can end on that, the big picture conception of reality.
I mean, let me just qualify that. I mean, I think I'd say broadly, I use physicalism at work to explain to myself and to patients what's happening to them neurologically. My own background is far more kind of wonky than that. I spent a lot of time in monasteries, in different spiritual traditions, and also I've always been really interested in different kinds of philosophical position outside of materialism. And I think one thing that psychedelics, I'm not sure what your question was exactly, but I think one thing that psychedelics shows up, even though it may have no direct answers for the hard problem of consciousness, or even smaller problems to do, more local problems to do, the easy problems of consciousness, it shows you how, just because of almost the mechanism of set and setting, how the premises by which people explore problems of consciousness constrain the problems, and the so-called observer effects are always going to be irreducible. And so there's something always again, just as with psychedelics, there's always something of one's own bias and one's own image that's inscribed into the thing that one's looking at. And therefore, one's premises, well, one's position, even if it's sort of robustly materialist, is gonna have cracks in it, and those cracks may be sort of dualistic or idealist or panpsychist, but it's just built into the way we can talk and think about ourselves.
Right. Yeah, and I like actually that distinction you made about at work using physicalism, because to me, there are multiple commitments with materialism, physicalism, whatever you want to call it, and the important one to me is what philosophers call supervenience. So the idea that the mind depends on the brain. And so if you're saying to someone, you've had damage to your brain and that's why these mental effects are happening, I think that's the thing we really want to take from materialism and keep. And then if you actually think materialism means reality is made of hard stuff, like that's not a philosophically sophisticated way of thinking about, so right. By fragmenting it that way, you can get to a more nuanced view that does embrace all these other perspectives you were talking about. So the book is 10 Trips. And is there anywhere else you would send people to if they want to look into your work more?
I've got a website, andymitchell.org. And that's it, really. That's it for the time being.
Great. Well, thanks, Andy. It's been really fun.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cooke.